Welcome to Brain Tumor Talk, a podcast brought to you by the Ivy Brain Tumor Center at Barrow Neurological Institute. This show unites leading experts, inspiring survivors, and compassionate caregivers in conversations about the latest in research and treatment. Together, we share stories filled with challenges and hope. I am your host, Michelle Palacino, a member of the Ivy Center team. My deep understanding of brain cancer comes from both my professional insights and personal experience as the daughter of a brain cancer patient. Brain Tumor Talk is your invitation to connect, learn, and find support in this community. The information shared on this podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. Nothing stated on this podcast should be considered medical advice. Welcome to Brain Tumor Talk. I'm your host, Michelle Palacino, and today we have with us Jacki Garcia. She is a nurse educator in neuro-surgical oncology at the Ivy Brain Tumor Center. Jacki, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Okay, so we want to start off by, can you tell us a little bit about your role at the Ivy Center and your previous role as a nurse navigator?
Yes. So currently I am a nurse educator, and I just moved into this position to help educate staff as they come in about neuro-oncology, because there's not a lot of base knowledge that people have when they start in a role like this. But I did 8 years of nurse navigating with neuro-oncology, neuro-surgical oncology more specifically. So my knowledge base really is from that period.
So cumulatively, how long have you been in the role of being a registered nurse, then transitioning to a nurse navigator, and now a nurse educator?
14 years. I started off originally in the neuro ICU at St. Joe's, spent about 7 years there, and then transitioned to the nurse navigator. And then over the last couple months, I've transitioned to the nurse educator.
Wow. So you have a plethora of experience
A little bit,
in the field.
Yes.
What does managing look like day to day for a caregiver? What is that like? You know, how do you balance it all?
Yeah. Very carefully. I wish I could paint a picture of this to make it a cookie cutter, but again, it goes back to what are the dynamics? It is. It's 100% different for everybody. One thing that I can say is that it doesn't matter your circumstances. The important thing is to be able to pull in your village, right? And this is where, everybody says it takes a village, to raise kids, for this, but this is 100% the same circumstance where, you utilize your friends, you utilize your church, you utilize your neighbors, people that are in your community, anybody who you can, give them little tasks, let them go grocery shopping for you. Do what you can to take the burden off of yourself. Right. And as a caregiver, self-care is one of the most important things that you can do, because if you deplete yourself, there's not going to be anything left for you to give, to be there for your loved one. Right. So, it's a fine
balancing act.
It is a fine balancing act.
It really is.
And as somebody who is not easily taking help from others. I've gone through my own experience where I did have to kind of take that step back and accept the help from others. So just knowing that might be something that you have to do, utilize it, because that's going to be one of your best resources.
Right. I would say that's probably one of the biggest things I've learned throughout the journey too, is that, a year in, I thought I was the biggest burden to everybody. I was like, oh my God, all these people are dropping everything to help me. And I was so appreciative. But then on the second year of dealing with this, honestly, people were like, we want to help. We want to feel, because when you're going through this, you feel helpless, and other people around you feel helpless because you don't even know what to ask for, So I realized into this that like your community wants to help you. They want to feel like they're contributing in some way. Yeah. So, when I first started all of this, and when my family first started all of this, we heard the term caregiver burnout for the first time. Yeah. Why don't you explain for our listeners who maybe have never heard this term, but they feel it. They for sure feel it. There is a term for it.
I feel like everybody knows what burnout is in general, just, after COVID and everything like that. We were all burnt out from life in general. But caregiver burnout more specifically is just not having those times to be able to fill your own cup and, constantly giving to everybody around you. And here's what I'll say, caregiving is one of the toughest jobs that anybody will ever do. And sometimes people feel guilty for wanting to take care of themselves in those moments. But it's honestly the best thing to do to make sure that you can continue caring for your loved one, So it's okay to have moments where you feel like you're being selfish and give back to yourself in those small moments that you can find. And even if it's 5 minutes in the bathroom where you can just sit there and be quiet.
Yes.
It can be anything. But basically caregiver burnout is when you keep going and going and going and aren't taking care of yourself. And then you come to the point that you have nothing left. And it's not something that waves a big red flag at you coming down the street. You know, it hits you and you're like, oh crap, here I am. And like, I'm struggling.
Yeah.
And this is where, you know, having a counselor for yourself can be helpful, you know, taking those times. I am a food person. So like I eat things that aren't always great for me, you know, it can look a million different ways for people, but just making sure that you're taking care of yourself.
Is there a mindset, or have you seen a mindset that caregivers have that you have seen as being like maybe more of an advantage in beating caregiver burnout? You know, like a mindset that some caregivers take, like, you know, basically what is a good mindset for some caregivers?
That's a tough one, because I don't think there's any right or wrong way. I don't think I can tell you that you have to have this mindset to be successful, because honestly, you know, is it good to have a positive attitude? Yeah, it is. But is it okay to have moments where you're, you know, crying in the bathroom by yourself?
Yeah, you know, in your car listening to some really sad playlist.
No.
Which, yeah.
100%. This is why we have movies that we cry in, though, right? You know, is that you have to kind of purge it. Yeah, it's therapeutic. You know, so I don't think there's any necessarily like right mindset, you know, as long as you can have those moments where you're kind of down in the dumps, but you can get back on the horse, you know, and that's the important thing. If we find that we're not getting back in the horse, we might already be in trouble. Right. And this is a time that we have to kind of start, you know, making sure that we're seeking help. Yeah. You know, and here's what I'm gonna say is depression for the person who's fighting the tumor, and also for the caregiver, is very common in this, and recognizing that we might be struggling with that is important, you know, and making sure that we're talking to somebody about it.
Yeah. Well, speaking of depression, I think that one of the things that leads to the depression is that, you know, after you get this diagnosis, it can feel like your life is consumed by doctor's appointments. Every day you go to doctor's appointments, you're seeing doctors, you're in and out of doctor, you know, it's all consuming. And so how can you make it so that the cancer doesn't just take over your lives? Yeah. You know?
Yeah. I feel like, so, I mean, and if we're specifically talking about glioblastoma diagnoses, or we'll say even just any high grade gliomas in that regard, you know, we go through typically this period of 6 weeks of treatment where things are really busy and you're kind of run down from the treatment and things like that. So I always tell people, you know, there's going to be a few months here where we're just really kind of, it's going to be a little hectic. It's going to be busy. We might kind of feel a little, you're in the thick of things. Yeah. But after that, it's going to lighten up, you know? And so this is where the doctor's appointments might spread out a little bit more. We've got space between our MRIs. This is where we plan, do we want to take a trip? And even if it's a small one, you know, what are the things that we want to do in these periods, and how do we get back to kind of some quote unquote normalcy? You know, that's the period that I tell people that, you know, this is where this is going to come, and we figure out what that looks like as we move into it.
Yeah. So I mean, when we look at like these periods of calm, for all the caregivers who are listening and they're like, oh my gosh, well, what happens if I have physical deficits now that I have to combat, you know, getting on an airplane and they're in a wheelchair, or, you know, what does the vacation look like if it wasn't the same? Like, how do we encourage people, you know? Yeah. And this is honestly something that my brother said, like, we're here to live, right? We're not here just to survive. We're here to live. And I know you've said this before a lot too, which is maybe where he stole it from.
But maybe. You know, I always tell people that we can't let this tumor run our life, right? It's important to understand it and not avoid it. We do what we need to do for it, but we don't let it run our life. So we do what we need to do. We get through that 6-week period of treatment and we get back to living life, you know? And so when we struggle, where, you know, there's a term out there called the new normal, right? And a lot of people probably hate this, but it's true. And I will say that in the mindset of things, people who fight that and keep trying to get back to where they were struggle more because they're fighting for something that might not always come, and they don't feel like they've gotten there until they get there. And if they don't get there, then they're always fighting for something that's not obtainable, right? So instead of fighting that, how do we start doing the things that we want to do, but maybe it just looks a little bit differently? Just because we can't necessarily, you know, go jump out of a plane like we used to, it doesn't mean we can't still have good experiences and positive, you know, moments. Yeah. So, and even more than moments, you know, it doesn't mean we can't still do things, right? So I think just figuring out what are those limitations that we're experiencing, how do we adapt them? And here's what I'll say is that in today's day and age, you know, there are a lot of adaptive tools out there to help us do things. So it's just figuring out what those are, what experience do you want to have, and how do we make it work? Right. So
how can patients find these tools?
Yeah.
Like
so
where can, National Brain Tumor Society is
well, I mean, here I'd even say starting with your social workers, your physical therapists, your occupational therapists, because those are the people who actually know about a lot of these tools, right? And okay, do we need a brace for this? How does this help us? You know, wheelchairs, you know, what kind of tools can we use in this?
Yeah.
The hard thing I think with this is this something that's covered with insurance, or is this something that we're paying out of pocket? You know, that's, I think, where some of those challenges come in.
Right.
But there's a lot of different ways to, you know, figure out how to make these things work. It just depends on the circumstance and what the deficits are that we're dealing with.
Yeah. You mentioned one of the things that we hear constantly, the new normal.
Yes.
So I have a bunch of questions, not a bunch of questions, but I have a few questions that have been submitted by caregivers that, and one of them honestly really does cover kind of the new normal. And so, and being resistant to the new normal, you know, because my family personally, like, you know, the new normal was like, we're going to get back to where we were. Yeah. That was kind of the threshold. And then 2.5 years into this, we're like, you know what, we just want to be okay. Yeah. Like any day that we're not in the hospital is a good day. Yeah. You know, which is definitely not our old normal. Yeah. But one of the questions was, I feel my loved one isn't understanding the gravity of the situation. How can I help them accept this diagnosis? Is this something that I should take on? So when you said the new normal, I was thinking, you know, obviously we're seeing like signs of denial here, right? Like my loved one's not accepting this diagnosis. So do you break that news to them that like this is not going to go back to what it was? Is that your role as a caregiver, or is that your doctor's role?
I would honestly say that I feel like that's more of a conversation with doctors. You know, even when I have conversations about pathology with people, if their loved one's not in the space to be able to understand the information, I'm talking to family members or whoever it may be, I don't put that on them to have to explain it when it's time, because that should never be a family member or caregiver's role, right? That's not your job. And one, we want to make sure that the information's relayed accurately and in an appropriate manner.
Right.
So I don't necessarily think that that's something that a family member has to do. And sometimes I don't even know if the conversation's been had and the information's been relayed and the person doesn't want to live in that reality. I don't know if that's necessarily something that has to happen. Yeah. You know, as long as we're out living our life and doing things that we want to, and it's not anything that's harmful, you know, what is the point of making them understand it, you know, or getting them to the point where unless it's, you know, are we talking about that we have to do paperwork or things to prepare that if things go south, we need to have these in place, and they're avoiding those things. That can be a little bit more challenging. And then it might be just putting a different angle on it. So of going, we need to do these because of X, Y, and Z, as opposed to because we have this diagnosis.
Right. And one thing I've heard is, you know, a lot of our loved ones, they are intelligent people, you know. Sometimes these protective mechanisms of denial come in more so as a protective mechanism for the caregiver, the kids, the family, the community that's involved, rather than, you know, a lot of people know the gravity. That's what I've been told.
Yes.
So
sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But, you know, I guess let's go by. I mean, what is the question there?
The question is basically, you know, like, it kind of loops back. Like, do you accept this diagnosis, or do you let them live in kind of a false reality, or not a false reality, but something that is a little bit more rosy?
Well, let me pose it to you this way too, is that, you know, when we first get this diagnosis, if, you know, we're fully functional, we have our, you know, facilities about us, you know, we're doing great, you know, do we need to stress the statistics on this? Do we need to, because here's the thing is, at the beginning, when we're going through all this and we're getting all the information, we're seeing how we respond to treatment, we don't know where anybody's going to fall. So, you know, if we talk about, oh, you know, we might only have, you know, so long, you know, left, what are we going to do in this time? It's great to kind of kick off some of those bucket list things in general, but you know, who's to say that we don't have a lot more time, you know? I mean, I always come back to the story of, you know, when I first started my navigator job, is that I sat down with this patient who somebody told him he had 6 months to live, and he hadn't even had surgery or a diagnosis yet, you know, and, you know, we did surgery with him. He went through a standard of care, you know, it was a GBM diagnosis. And to this day, he hasn't had a recurrence. Yeah. What is different about him? I don't know. But if somebody sat down and told him and he just accepted that he was going to die in 6 months, like his journey would have been very different. Yeah. You know, so if we succumb to the statistics, just at the beginning, people aren't going to do as well. And there's nothing that says that we're going to, fit into this timeline, right?
Yeah.
There's people that are exceeding the statistics every single day.
Yeah, my mom's one of them.
100%, And so I don't think we need to necessarily drive that home. It's important, though, if we start to see that we're struggling, though, that we're having realistic conversations, but what people choose to do with that information is their own,
Yeah. I always think back to, when this first happened, you made a comment about an expiration.
Nobody's put an expiration date on the bottom of your foot.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Like a banana or something.
No, I mean... No, but it's true though, right?
It definitely is.
What happens when that day comes? Are you digging a hole and jumping into it? No, we're going to continue to live life, know? And that's the important thing.
Yeah. So question number 2 from one of our caregivers was, my loved one has experienced personality changes since they started treatment, and it's very different. How do I respond to a situation like this?
So it depends on what the personality change is. So it might be that we're having short-term memory issues. It might be that we just don't do things the same way. Sometimes the person can be very different just depending on the location of tumor. Some areas control our personality. Where it becomes more of a situation that is a challenge is if we're having like aggressive behavior or things like that. And that can be very challenging. And here's what I'll say in that is that's definitely a point to be calling your doctor and saying, hey, here's what we're struggling with. This is what we're going through.
Yeah.
Is this getting to be a dangerous situation? Or is this something that, we just have to figure out what angles we need to work to be able to get around that difficult personality.
Right.
So there's multiple different ways that a different personality can look. So I would say also the hard thing with that is that there's no two pictures that look exactly the same because one person might function in a different manner. Is that I might be able to say, oh, I need to go to the store, but they're resistant to get into the car because they have something else that they're focused on.
Yeah.
But is there some trick that I know that might motivate them to actually want to get into the car? Can I use tools to my advantage?
Yeah. Yeah. And this is where the challenges I feel like come in with the caregiver, right? How much of this is something that can be managed with medication and you talk to your oncologist. Or, if they're seeing a mental health specialist, is this somebody that, when do you get your physician involved versus when do you think, okay.
I think you start with the physician 100% because also too, is it a common medication for patients to be on after, they've experienced a seizure and then we found a brain tumor and we kind of go through this is Keppra. And Keppra can cause mood changes in people and it can cause them sometimes to be a little angry and aggressive, so if we start to see that, sometimes it's like, okay, do we need a different medication? So sometimes things can be medication related, but sometimes it can be based off tumor location and what the patient's going through. So it's always a conversation to start with your physician.
Yeah. This one, I really resonate with this question. I find myself in a constant state of worry and anxiety about the future. Many people say take it one day at a time, but how do you deal with the anticipatory grief and the loss associated with this disease?
Yeah. That's a very difficult.
Yeah, it is.
Well, I feel like there's...
And a lot of people I'm not sure have even heard... I had never heard the term anticipatory grief. I never heard of it. And... this question specifically, the loss associated with this disease, because it doesn't just come with death, right? Yeah. You are grieving throughout the process.
That's the anticipatory grief.
Right. But you're grieving who they were, who your family members were, the loss of innocence among like your family. There's like so many levels of grief that comes with this disease.
Yeah.
And so it's a really layered question, I think.
No, it is. So let's start kind of at the beginning. Was there something, you said something before anticipatory grief?
Yeah, I find myself in a constant state of worry and anxiety. Take it one day at a time. How do you deal with the anticipatory grief and the loss?
Okay. So let's start with like the worry and the anxiety.
Yeah.
And some of that I feel like comes back to coping mechanisms. We go back to what can we control and what can't we control. So when we have this diagnosis, the steps in the future, we don't have a lot of control over as far as what is this tumor going to do. So, finding some way to deal with that, whether it be, self-care, whether it be counseling, whether it be whatever works for you and trying to manage that, unfortunately, is a very individual process as well. But being able to manage that and just know, I always tell people, plan for the future, have things to look forward to. You don't just stop doing things and we don't just sit and wait for this tumor to do what it's going to do, because then we're missing out on on that element of living, right? But I think talking about grief in this too is very important, because a lot of people don't. They think that when their loved one passes, that's when the grief starts, but it isn't. And if you haven't heard anticipatory grief, it's basically anytime, you are dealing with something significant like that, and you have a big life change, and you're going through this process of dealing with losing what was before and moving into what is now, right? Or what might be coming up ahead. And so understanding that it is a grief process of everything that you said, of the relationship that you had with this person, who they were, who you were, all of your dreams and goals and everything that you might have had with this person. There's so many things. And it can be very different for, we were going to grow old together versus, we were going to have all these milestones if it's a parent or something like that. So knowing that coping mechanism with that, like counseling and things like that, but just dealing with grief, which is, what people, typically people, when they go through a big loss, will go through counseling, some kind of grief counseling in that regard. Yeah. What was that third part?
The loss associated with the disease.
Yeah, the loss. And I think that all kind of ties in.
Yeah, it all does tie in together.
It all does tie in. But in the nursing profession, one of the blessings that comes with this is that it shows me how fragile life is every day, right? And so it allows me to try and live each day for what I want it to be, right? And so I think making sure that we're doing that, we don't hold on waiting for things, as you go, we can have these feelings and we process these feelings, but we take advantage of the time that we have, and make the experiences, but just know too, is that we don't know how much time it will be. And so we keep living life to the fullest until then.
Right. And along with, the patient experiencing denial, I do think that your caregivers are also experiencing the 5 stages of grief, which includes denial, and you kind of hit it right on the head for the first time in your lives, whether it's a husband and a wife, or a mother and a daughter, or a son and a father, whatever the relationship is, your futures do not align like they used to. Yeah. One of you is on a completely different trajectory than the other. Yeah. Now. And that is a very hard concept, I think, to grasp. Yeah. Yeah. And so I do think it is kind of up to the individual. And you did mention it, like a lot of the self-care techniques, talking to, counselor, self-care, things like this. But going into self-care, this is our last question from our caregivers. And it was, I'm a mother of 3. I work full-time, and I'm the primary caregiver of my husband. How can I incorporate my own health and well-being when I'm providing this type of intensive care for everybody else? Yeah. Which is true. I remember when my mom was first diagnosed, and somebody was like, you need to take a day out of the week to treat yourself. I was like, a day? Yeah. I can't even shower without thinking my mom's going to fall. I would hear a sound and I would run out of the shower and I'd be like, oh my God, is everybody okay? Yeah. Yeah. So I'm like, take a day. Yeah. Like this person, I was like, oh my God.
Well, this is where I say 5 minutes. You know, like let's start with bite size. But I think when you start with smaller pieces and you start to see that, you can do that. And I can take an hour for myself and I can do this. You get a little bit more confident in being able to take some of those breaks away, right? And so this is where the village comes in, you know, and utilizing your resources. And I think sometimes it's very challenging when people don't have their community or their village. We have to get creative. Are we able to afford respite care, where somebody can come in for a little bit? Right. Utilize your support groups because, at least for our support group, when we come in, we separate between our caregivers and our survivors. So at least the caregivers have an opportunity to have an hour to focus on themselves. It can be very challenging, but it is 100% where we need to make sure that we're bringing people in. And it doesn't have to be taking a whole day to yourself. It can be just taking an hour, is grocery shopping quiet time for you. Right. But I will say too, is that sometimes I think people put hurdles in front of themselves by saying, I can't do this, I can't do this, I can't do this, as opposed to going, how do I make this work? Right. And so coming into it with a different mindset sometimes can be helpful, and just utilizing whatever you can to be able to take those breaks away, and just knowing it's okay to give yourself permission to go get your nails done, to get your hair done. Right. Whatever it is that you need to do for you, and it's okay. Yeah. So you did mention, we know that there are plenty of people out there who don't have the village, who don't have, friends or family, or they live in other states,
So can you explain a little bit about respite care?
Yeah. So respite care is something where you can hire somebody to come in and sit with your loved one for a period of time or have breaks away. Even hospice facilities will do respite care, so you can bring your loved one in and have them stay if there's something going on that you kind of need some assistance. I think this is another situation you go back and you talk to your social workers about, what are my resources for this?
Right.
So there are facilities or organizations more specifically that will help with some of these things, and just being able to sit down and talk with somebody to figure out what's out there and what's available for you can be helpful. The other element of this that I find that people struggle with is trusting other people with their loved one, right?
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I'll say too is that they don't have to care for them the exact same way that you do. Nobody's going to care for them the same way, their spouse or their mother or their daughter or whoever it is going to. But, is it a positive experience for your family member? Are they safe during it? Those are the important things.
How do you go about finding respite care? Where are the Googling respite care?
Yeah, 100% you can Google respite care, and do obviously research the reviews on the organizations and things like that. But it's the same thing. There's local organizations here. Obviously, it's going to be more local to your region.
Right.
So, but you can Google respite care or talk to your social workers in the hospital, and they're going to give you resources for being able to do that.
Right. I think most people who are listening, when they heard you say hospice, were probably clutching their pearls, because most people are familiar with hospice. And I personally, when people say hospice, I'm like, oh my God, we are at the end of our rope here. So is there a difference between respite care and end of life care?
Yes, 100%. Respite care is just coming in to take a break. Obviously, hospice care is support during end of life process. But can we talk about that? Can I just say that
absolutely.
I feel like
I had a question it was more about, how do you have these conversations? This is, when you actually do pull back and you look at the forest through the trees, end of life planning is super important.
It is, but none of us do it.
Yeah, because nobody is ever confronted with their mortality before something like this happens.
Let me tell you, I fought with my parents for so long to do a living will, to put everything in order. Let's just get it done.
So you're like,
because I'm a nurse, right? Don't ask me if I have one, but I have a living will. Medical power of attorney. But I fought with them for so long to do it, and the day that they came home and sat the folder in front of me because they had done it, I cried.
Yeah.
Because it is a hard conversation to have.
Yeah.
And one, I think for us as a society, right? I mean, I don't know. Do you know anybody who's gotten away from never dying in life?
I know.
It's something that we're all going to go through, but I don't know why we are all so afraid of talking about it, because it is something that we need to prepare for.
Anticipatory grief.
Anticipatory grief, right? No,
nobody wants to deal with.
Nobody wants to talk about it, in general. But I think it's healthy to talk about it. I don't think people should be afraid to talk to their loved ones about it. What are your wishes? What are your goals? Because one, death doesn't have to be scary. Death can actually be a beautiful process. When I worked in the ICU, we sometimes withdrew care on people, and people would bring in things that their loved ones liked. They would play music, they would have, scents, and, it can be a very personal and touching process, And so I think if we can plan, if we can talk about these things, if we can make sure that we know what our loved ones want, it doesn't have to be such a traumatic process, because we're a little bit more prepared for it.
Right.
And so I think those conversations are important. I think making sure that we know what everyone's threshold is, because the biggest thing too is that as we go through a brain tumor process, if we get to the point where the quality of life is not what that person would find acceptable, that's the point that we have to kind of start having different conversations.
Right.
And I think it's important for somebody who's making decisions for somebody else to understand where that is, and make sure that we're keeping in line with that person's wishes.
Yeah. How do you maintain a sense of sensitivity when you approach this conversation with your loved one?
Yeah. So, I probably wasn't too sensitive with my parents.
Yeah. But for somebody that's just been diagnosed, they know.
Well, and so it depends on what element we're talking about. Is it one, whenever anybody comes into the hospital, we ask them, do you have a living will? Do you have a medical power of attorney? Just because it's a standard question. And here's what I'll tell you, I have one, just because if I get into a car accident, I want my husband to know what my wishes are. Right. And I want everybody to know who my designated person is, so I think, to maintain tact in that is it doesn't necessarily have to be just because you have this brain tumor diagnosis. We're having this conversation.
Right.
One, if you're in our hospital and your family members with us, we can do one for you too. This is something that everybody should just kind of have to cover your bases, to make sure that, your wishes are followed. If heavens forbid anything happen, if I leave here today and get into a car accident, I want Matt to be comfortable and know that he's not making heavy decisions without being confident in what he is doing. I will say the most stressful thing when people get into circumstances, and brain tumor diagnosis aside, but just if you're in the hospital and you're looking at having those conversations, having any kind of doubt on what your loved one would have wanted puts more stress on that person than if they had it. And so,
having no gray areas.
But here's what I'll tell you, even at that, and just know that if, you do end up in that position, you do second guess. It took me 3 times reading my mom's living will before I was confident in what I was doing for her and making sure that it was in line. So just know it's a difficult process no matter what. And this is something that I'm well versed in, so somebody who's never experienced this before, just know that if you are struggling a little bit, you need some time to process, or you're second guessing things a little bit, just take a breath and, you come back to it.
Yeah.
But I think the important thing is just knowing that these aren't necessarily like brain tumor conversations, but these are conversations that everybody should have with their family members, because it's important to know it.
Yeah. And if people are looking for, where do I start, right? I've just been diagnosed. Do I hire an attorney? Maybe I don't have the resources to hire an attorney. Yeah. Do I, go through a service online? Like, how do people even find these directives? Where do they go?
Yeah. So the hospital will give you advanced directives, and the chaplain will help you fill it out, and they do it for free. So that's kind of the base start. One thing that's important to know also is that there's a difference between a medical power of attorney and a durable power of attorney.
Right.
A medical power of attorney allows somebody to make decisions for you only for your medical care. So they have no access to your finances or anything like that. But it's only if you can't make decisions for yourself. The durable power of attorney will come into play when it has to do more with your bank accounts and paying your bills and things like that. So, but they are 2 separate documents, and typically the durable power of attorney is not something that's done in the hospital. It would be something done with a lawyer or with an online service.
Right.
So, the more complicated part of it is doing that complete will, right? Which can include sometimes the living will and medical power of attorney element to it. So if you're kind of covering assets and things like that, that might be a point that you want to get an attorney that can help you with that process versus, finding, if it's just basic stuff, something online that you can fill out to cover your bases.
Got it. And so switching gears to a more light note.
Yes.
You mentioned, I guess it's not really a light note, because I'm going to bring up mortality again. But you mentioned that it can be a very dignified and personal, intimate process of passing.
Yeah.
And so, how do caregivers in general find fulfillment and a sense of accomplishment in their caregiving role? Maybe it's not, maybe this doesn't have anything to do with the end of life process, But just throughout the entire process, how does a caregiver find purpose in this? How do they find fulfillment?
I mean, I think I can only speak to this from my own caregiving side.
Yeah.
Is it, for me, and just let me be clear, is that my parents didn't passive brain tumors, and, I cared for them on different levels. My mom had a stroke, and she had some cognitive issues after, and my dad had been diagnosed with bladder cancer, and had some more physical issues and things like that. So when they were going through those treatments, they were living with us. And so for me, it was, we had our ups and our downs and stuff like that, whereas I knew that they had a safe place. They were well cared for. They had, transportation to their appointments if they needed it and things like that, So for me, knowing that they were just safe and taken care of and had the things that they need gave me some fulfillment, When I came home and my mom had rearranged my kitchen and I wasn't happy about it, that was another day, But, that doesn't mean that there aren't challenges in it too, So I think, one, don't get hard on yourself if, you have a bad day and you maybe didn't act in the best way that you wanted to. But and where I say that this is one of the hardest jobs that anybody will ever do, it's probably one of the most fulfilling, and just in the fact that this person is counting on you and you're the one who's stepping up to, be there for them. And it might not even just be you. It might be, family members or friends or things like that kind of come in. But I think for me, that's my understanding, or it was my experience, is just knowing that, I took care of them. I was able to honor their wishes and did the best that I could for them. And I feel like I was successful in that.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. I would classify you as even more of a caregiver beyond your personal experience. You know, you were an extraordinary caregiver for your parents, but you're also an extraordinary caregiver for every patient that you've touched, you know, and their families. I would consider you probably the strongest beacon of support that my family has had throughout this entire journey. So with that being said, when you're looking at your role specifically in a professional capacity, what would you say is the hardest part about your job and the best part about your job?
Yeah. So, you know, and it's funny when you say caregiver in that regard is that, yes, I care for people, you know, but it's also not the same as how like a family member cares. So I separate that, you know, because it's not on the same level. Like I care for people and you call me, I'm going to talk to you and
I don't know how you don't experience massive burnout. I'm burnout just calling you.
I've been there, you know, But again, so, and this is even too, is that, you know, I find myself a very strong person in general, emotionally, you know, and whether or not that's good or bad as it kind of comes through this. But, you know, after going through my own personal experience with my parents and coming back into a job where I am delivering this news of, you know, serious diagnoses and helping people through a process and dealing with losing my patients. You know, I'll tell you, like, I grieve my patients, you know, I've never been one of those nurses that develop thick skin.
Right.
So I connect with people and I'm going to find out what you like and I want to know about you. And, you know, we're going to joke about things and you know, people share personal things with me and I'm going to give you some pieces of me as well. You know, it's not one-sided in this, you know. So when I will say, the best part of my job is the people that I get to meet.
Right.
You know, and
you're welcome.
I've met some very, you know, incredible people over the years. And, you know, and honestly, I hold a piece of each one of them in my heart, you know, and I like think back of stories and, you know, I have cards that I'll flip through, you know, in this binder of just like going back to them and stuff. And, you know, it's amazing to think of all the people that I have interacted with over the years. The hardest part of my job is when we lose somebody, you know, just because you do grieve them and you had this connection. And so there's a grief process that comes with that as well, you know? So, but I also take pride in the fact that if I can make it a little bit easier for somebody, you know, then I'm going to come back every day, you know, and I'm going to try and help you through this. So.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. On that note, so we often hear the expression one day at a time. And sometimes we know it's 1 day, 1 minute, 1 second, 1 breath, you know, at a time. Yeah. So to wrap up the episode, we would like to do a quick one fire question of a thing or an idea or something that holds significance to you.
Okay.
So what is one piece of advice you would give to your younger self?
My younger self. Accept help when you need it. Yeah.
What's one thing people would be surprised to learn about you?
I mean, I love sharks. I don't know if they'd be surprised for that, but we'll just go with that I scuba dive. I like to scuba dive.
That's a good one.
Okay.
What's one place you'd buy a one-way ticket to?
Ooh, somewhere tropical. We'll say the Virgin Islands.
What's one habit you'd like to break?
Maybe not taking as much self-care as I should.
I don't think that's a good one. That's not a bad habit. What's one thing you do to de-stress?
Oh, so I do like to eat food. I like puzzles. There's a lot of things that I do. I do staycations. You know, I love to take vacations. There's a lot of things. I'll talk to you about that all day long. But, so that doesn't answer the question, but all of those things.
What's your favorite restaurant? What's one of your favorite restaurants?
It depends on what I'm craving at that moment, honestly. So it all depends on the kind of food, but I will say that probably Italian is my favorite. So.
Okay. And then what's one thing you're most proud of? We should get tissues.
No, I don't know if I have a good answer for that one.
I have a good answer for that one. All of the patients that you've touched, you are a phenomenal daughter. You are a phenomenal wife. You're a phenomenal mom. Yeah. You're great at your job.
Can I tell you a funny story?
Yeah, let's hear it.
So, if we're talking about the pride senses, my mom was ridiculously proud of me. it was funny because when, so during COVID, they did the year of the nurse. And so they highlighted me for October. So my mom was in the hospital over at Boswell during this period. And I was on the phone with her, and her doctor came in, so I was able to ask questions and stuff like that. And she broke out her phone with a picture of me with the year of the nurse, and she was trying to tell him that I was like the nurse of the year. So I was like, no, this is not the situation. But no, I think probably if I had to answer something along those lines is that, I'm proud of the fact that no matter what, I was always there for my parents. They were always there for me, but we had a very tight bond. And I'm proud of the fact that I was able to take them through their life and honor all of their wishes through that.
Yeah. Jacki, you have so much to be proud of. You're an incredible person.
Well, I appreciate that.
And I think you suffer from imposter syndrome for sure. I don't even think I could quantify the impact that you've had on so many lives. Like every life you touch, just, you're a bright light. And you bring so much joy and positivity and hope. And I just think you underestimate yourself.
I appreciate that. I just think I don't look at it as being proud of myself for doing that. That's just me. Like I like people, I love the connections that I make with people. And so for me, it's a good day.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, so I appreciate those words. Thank you.
Yeah. You're definitely the exception, not the rule. So what's one thing you'd like to be remembered for?
Oh, let's see. Probably some of the goofy things that I do sometimes. So this is PG, so we'll keep it there. But I'm known for kind of stepping outside the boundaries a little bit. So, for just doing some fun things sometimes.
Yeah.
So.
Well, Jacki, thank you so much for joining the Brain Tumor Talk podcast. You were exceptional.
Well, thank you.
You could be proud of this. No, but really, it was great having you.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it.
We hope this episode has informed and inspired you. Subscribe to Brain Tumor Talk so you don't miss another episode, and please consider leaving us a review to help others in the brain tumor community find us.